Hello again, I'm Dan Ward, and this is going to be the bonus episode, part 4 of Constructed Accumulated Knowledge. In this episode, we're going to do a final thoughts and a final run-through of the exact 75 that I'll be playing this weekend in Grand Prix Denver. And we'll also break down the metagame to where we started with the deck and where it's at now. There hasn't been many changes, but I do want to indicate and talk about a few things. So we're going to get right to it. Here we go. Hey everyone, I'm Dan Ward, and this is part 4 of Constructed Accumulated Knowledge, where we're going to be doing a breakdown of the final thoughts, and we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to start off by saying, here we are. This is days before the Grand Prix that we're actually filming this, and this is as close and concise as I can give you to the 75 that I will be playing. So let's start off, and I'm going to pull it right up. Boom! Here we are. Hopefully you can see everything. We have 21 lands and a bunch of spells, some cool creatures, and yeah, this is the deck. It is red-green Marvel splashing white, or we could call it just Naya Marvel is fine. We've come a long way since the green-black that we started with, and a lot of the cards are similar to the last episode. We have made a few changes, and I want to highlight those. The Deadlock Traps. We had a problem. Myself and Cody were working on the deck together, dealing with Chandra's, Resolved Chandra's, and Resolved Gideon's. And I kind of thought of a card that produces energy, it uses energy, and it helps us with dealing with both of those problems, but also just randomly came upon this in a blue-white flash matchup, where being able to lock down their Gideon is great, but tapping down their creatures is also pretty instrumental after the sideboard plan, which I'll get into a little bit later. We cut the Nahiri down to 1. I like the card, however, there was a couple instances I found where it could be actually used against us. So what happens sometimes is when you're playing these long drag-out games versus red-green and also versus green-black, your opponent is going to have enough time, because this deck is, constructed in a control manner and not like an explosive combo manner, to being able to take your turns. And if you have this, or they're able to use your Marvel and then play it, they can, eat your Marvel. They could eat maybe one of your Emrakuls if you had an Emrakul in play. And it just has, points of the game where it's really good, where you can take your opponent's Aetherworks Marvel out if you're in the mirror. But it can be used against you, and also it's really not good versus the creature matchups. When we're talking about the black red aggro, we're talking about the Mardu aggro, the decks that are pretty popular right now, and even the red-white vehicles is still lingering around. So we cut that down to 1. The only thing I'm missing with having only 1 Nahiri now is it does change the Delirium count. We still have Harness Lightning, so we have the instants, but only having the 1 Planeswalker, we can't really count on that being an actual Delirium target. If we get it, it's great. If not, so be it. Creature-wise, we stayed the same. We are still playing 2 big Ishkanas. We're playing 3 Emrakuls. Those are our big creature hits. I've talked a lot about Descend Upon the Sinful in this series, and hopefully for those of you that are plan on playing this deck or giving it a try, maybe at an F&M, or even showing up to the Grand Prix like myself with it, you can see the overall power of this card. And sorcery speed is great, but when you're clicking it off a Marvel after they activated their Gideon and their vehicles, and they don't see it coming, it's pretty fantastic, Delirium, obviously, getting the 4/4 Angels is really what you want to be doing with this card as well, because you're just netting all the cards that they had in play, while getting a 4/4 Angel is a pretty good deal for 6 mana, or kind of for 4 mana for free almost. And the last new addition to the card, or excuse me, to the deck rather, is Nissa's Renewal. So I'm still on the fence about this card, and this is probably the one card that I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to run at the Grand Prix. But I'll tell you why I like this card. Everything else in the deck pretty much has a specific purpose. And this card kind of is like an outlier in that it gains life, and other than the Puzzle Knots, we don't have really a way to gain that much life. And so there'll be times where if, let's just say, for instance, I was running an Ulamog instead of a Nissa's Renewal, where if I have an Ulamog in my hand, it's very tough to cast in this deck, naturally. So it's kind of like a dead card. And so, if I have that and I have, that and an Emrakul, it's a must mulligan. Where, Nissa's Renewal is, a playable 6 that I can actually reliably get to between Servant of Conduits and resolving like Ishkanas to defend. And once I actually cast the card, the gaining 7 life is so significant to being able to have another turn to utilize the Aetherworks Marvel and or getting me enough lands in play to be able to actual hard cast Emrakul. It's pretty significant. With this being, like I said before, a control shell as opposed to a combo shell, it's also a card that not a lot of people are going to be familiar with playing around. So they may like do a couple things differently to try to get that extra couple points of damage in. And then when you go to Aetherworks Marvel on their turn, you can just play Nissa's Renewal, and it might have like taken away the line that they thought was going to be the successful winning line for them. And so it has a little bit of that like catch people off guard line. But I just think generally with this being less of the explosive Marvel shell, that like a card like this can really like do a lot of work. So that's where I'm at with our 60. Now I'll scroll over. Here we go. We got our sideboard, and some of the things have changed here. We still have 2 natural states. We cut 1. We have 2 tiers of Valkut. Those are really good versus the blue-white matchup. Natural state, pretty self-explanatory. We're bringing that in versus blue-white. We're bringing it in versus red-black vehicles and maybe the Colossus deck if that's still going to be around for the Grand Prix. A couple cards that we see that are different. We have the 3rd Deadlock Trap because like I expressed before, I really think this card's really phenomenal in a lot of like the mirror match-esque matchups, as well as it was actually showing to be pretty good versus blue-white. So we're going to test that out a little bit more before the Grand Prix, but I like the card a lot. Long Tusk Cub. Originally, when I played at the Pro Tour, I played 4 Long Tusk Cubs and 3 Bristling Hydras in my sideboard for the transformable sideboard plan versus the control decks and the decks that we're going to be playing a ton of Ceremonious Rejections. So this has a similar concept. We don't have Bristling Hydra, we have Tireless Tracker to gain some more value. But I think Long Tusk Cub is really good, and the main matchup we want it versus is blue-white. Because if we're on the play especially and we can go turn 1 Attune into turn 2 Long Tusk Cub, it really hinders them on having a Declaration in Stone, a Stasis Snare, or a Reflector Mage, which is really good for us because like if they're having to Reflector Mage the Long Tusk Cub, it leaves a window of opportunity for you to be able to actually hardcast the Aetherworks Marvel. And it's pretty strong. Like, yes, you don't want to dump all your energy into the Cub and just spew because then they can just Stasis Snare it and you feel bad. But if they don't have the Stasis Snare, like, well, it does 2 things. So first, they have to have the Stasis Snare, and 2, that's less Stasis Snares that they have in their deck to like take away your Emrakuls and maybe your World Breakers and cards like that and Ishkanas. So that's one element. But being able to like make them have to tap out to deal with the Long Tusk Cub is really where like I think the worth of Long Tusk Cub shows, because people get put behind. And now you're having them play cards like Spell Queller as in like to block once you get a couple turns with some energy, and really shows its worth. We talked about Tireless Tracker. We want that in versus a lot of the mirror matchups on the play. We like it versus blue-white on the play, and versus some of the grindy decks, we want just something else to utilize some card draw and just go long. This card right here, Radiant Flames, most people are familiar with it. It's the board wipe of choice for sorcery speed for red. People have been playing Kozilek's Return. All of the red-green Aetherworks Marvel decks play Kozilek's Return. And the reason why I like Radiant Flames is because I think 3 is actual detrimental to this format now. We have everything from Dapala to, trying to think of some more 3s. There's Gnarlwood Dryad that's been showing up a little bit more with Delirium in the aggressive green-black shell. You have Spell Queller. You have Reflector Mage. And in the Mardu Vehicles decks, like Dapala is the main one that comes to mind. But just having a mass removal spell that we can actually take care of the 3 toughness creatures is kind of significant. And the creature matchups in general are pretty good for this deck, but I wanted another card to bring in because I had looked at the sideboard and I have a lot here for like the mid-range, the control, and the mirror, and I didn't have a ton of cards for the aggressive matchups. And so traditionally what I do is I take out like the Nahiri, I cut an Emrakul, and I usually cut a Vessel. And so I wanted to have at least 3 cards that I can bring in, which would be the 2 Natural States and the Radiant Flames at this point. Because otherwise I'm just keeping a Vessel in, and it's kind of slow versus the aggressive decks. So, and then lastly, we still have Sigarda, we have World Breaker, and we have Ulamog. I kind of like a selection here of each one of these cards has different roles in the matchups that I'm bringing it in. And it diversifies our threat package versus the green-black Delirium deck, which is a good matchup. But after sideboard, it can be pretty tricky between Lost Legacies and Pick the Brains. It can be pretty frustrating when someone Lost Legacies all your Emrakuls. And if you look at this deck, it's kind of, you take all the Emrakuls, it can be hard to win, like even though we have Ishkanas. And I've had it happen where one black-green opponent like Lost Legacied me, took all my Emrakuls, and then in addition, picked the brain and got all my Descend Upon the Sinfuls. So, needless to say, I lost that match, and it was very tough for me to try to find a line at that point that I could even win from. So with that being said, I wanted to bring in a bunch of cards, you know, at least a few cards that I could actually count on to close the games and or be, like I said, a diversified package. Sigarda, also I got to speak volumes on how good this card has been versus green-red. Pretty much any Emrakul deck, I'm bringing Sigarda in. And it's just like a house. Like they can't kill it with Chandra. They can kill it with Harness Lightning, but usually they're shaving a few Harness Lightnings in the mirror, and also they have to they have to really dictate their Harness Lightnings and put them toward the servants if I play it on turn 2. So a lot of times it's going to get to a point where they're either using it on their servants or Tireless Trackers that I brought in, and they kind of run out of ways to deal with this. And like I said, Chandra doesn't get rid of it. And it's just like, wow, like you see how much like Emrakul 13/13 trampling flyer is pretty phenomenal. But when you don't have the come into play cast trigger, the cast trigger, it kind of takes away from the card a lot for a 13 mana spell. So there's been a ton of times where, you know what I mean, I have Sigarda in play and my opponent Emrakuls, and it's just like, man, if he would have took my turn here, it would be really bad news. He'd be able to use all my energy up, and then you know, kind of play a couple spells like Traverses and Vessels and Attunes and just like take away a lot of the value that I have on the board and in my hand. And by having Sigarda, it just takes away from that and then allows me to like sculpt the game in a manner of which I can just not have to worry about the cast trigger. And, you know, kind of to speak about this deck, we're not too worried about Emrakul just because we, like I said, we have 4 Descend Upon the Sinfuls. And so it puts them in a really awkward position because they don't want to cast it because then we usually get the 4/4. And then we can attack them for it and then untap and keep going. So we're usually in a pretty good position versus the Emrakul decks, but it can be kind of tricky, and you never want people taking your turns. So, so there's the overview of the 75 that we plan on playing. I'd say most likely the cards that are questionable that could come out is the Radiant Flames, the Deadlock Trap from the sideboard. I'd say the other 13 cards are kind of like, you know, hard locks. And then lastly, there's going to be a little bit more discussion with my friend Cody and maybe a couple other friends on what they think about Nissa's renewal. I've had limited experience with playing it. It's been okay so far. It hasn't really lost me any games. And it's definitely won me a few. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's the deck. Now let's go into let's take a look at where we are metagame-wise. So I definitely want to highlight the fact that we still see white, blue, and black, green dominating, although black, green Delirium has taken kind of a dive in that you could see it's only 16.82% of the meta now, which when we started this series, it was almost close to 30%. The big takeaway from start to finish is the green-red Aetherworks Marvel deck. And I kind of put the deck, the Naya Aetherworks, what we're playing, it falls into this category. You know, yes, we're splashing for Descend. We have like some white cards, and we have obviously Nahiri, that's a white card as well. But these decks kind of operate the same way. You know, the only difference being really that I see main deck is that the green-red Aetherworks deck has Chandra, and they play 3 copies of it, and usually 1 in the sideboard. And that card just accelerates them. It's just kind of like a Collective Defiance Planeswalker, I guess is the best way for me to describe it. It has so many different modes that can be utilized in that deck's like so many different ways, and it's just really good. And it's a card that I wish the mana could support my deck playing. But unfortunately, double red, double white, wanting green on turn 1, it's just a little too greedy for the deck. So, but yeah, green red Aetherworks Marvel, you see right now 13.64%. When we started this series, it was below 5%. So that is a big takeaway going into Grand Prix Denver. I've kept my eye on this deck a while. I've been watching Jabberwocky stream here and there. And I guess bringing him up, well, we could talk about the PTQ that I played in last weekend. You see here that we have, his green-red list. He's 7-0'd. He made it to the top 4 of the PTQ and then lost. So seeing here, green-red Aetherworks, and we have other decks in here. We have, Mardu Vehicles, red-black aggro, like some of these outliers that aren't as quite the percentage as blue-white flash, black-green delirium. And it just goes to show that I think right now, Standard is at a weird place where there is a lot of decks to play, which is great. But the overall consensus is that white-blue is the best, but people are finding ways to beat it because it's the best. It's kind of like the theory from when going into a tournament, like this is the best deck in the tournament, regardless of how the matchup is, you're always going to have a couple cards to beat that deck or to side in versus that deck to just improve your matchup because it's just logic. If we go into Denver and we were to take this metagame, every 4th opponent I'd be playing blue-white. So if I knew that going into the tournament that every 4th round I'm going to be playing blue-white, that means I'm going to play them 5 to 6 times. And if that's the case, I want to have some decent sideboard cards because I know that I'm going to play that deck a lot and I want to be able to improve my percentage. Unfortunately, sometimes the online metagame, and I guess usually doesn't reflect the live metagame, especially at a Grand Prix. We're talking about Grand Prix Denver, of course. There's going to be 1,500 players there. That's the cap. So I think it'll probably get a little below cap. But just kind of highlighting the fact that when I'm talking about the standard metagame, mind you, this isn't like hard as a rock. This isn't, hey, this is what you're going to definitely play, expect. It's just like a rough hypothesis. This is an educated guess based on the decks that are showing up online. It's going to change as time goes on. And like I said, we have a couple days before the Grand Prix. So there's going to be even more things that change. And with a deck like green-red Aetherworks improving and seeing black-green Delirium go down, you're going to see people start to put more things. And I've seen it with playing on Moto. There's been a lot more hate for Aetherworks Marvel. Cards like Negate, and Summary Dismissal and Void Shatter. Those are the standard things that people are playing in control decks and blue decks. But when you start seeing people play more Ceremonious Rejections, that's when you start to concern yourself a little bit with, okay, well, we need to have a game plan versus these decks, and pulling the deck up. Versus the blue decks, we do have it. We have Tireless Trackers, we're bringing in some other creatures, and maybe Long Tusk Cubs. So it makes me think about when I'm looking at, hey, we're preparing for white-blue, black-green, now the mirror match for sure. Mardu Vehicles, which I'll group with red-black and red-white, even though they're different decks, and I don't want to say a sideboard necessarily different because they have a lot of key components that my sideboard cards for the aggressive matchups, like Natural State, really are there for. Hey, I want to hit Smuggler's Copter. For Mardu Vehicles, I want to hit the Caravan. For red-black, I want to hit cards like Key to the City, and I want to hit Smuggler's Copter. Guess what? Red-white Vehicles has Smuggler's Copter in it. And some of them play Key to the City in the sideboard I've seen. But basically, Smuggler's Copter is the #1 card that I want to hit because, first of all, it hits pretty hard and giving your opponent the availability to loot. We don't need people having Robo-Jaces. Not around here. Not in my world. And then, so going after that, we're looking at Black-Red Zombies, which I haven't played a lot, but still out there. Control decks, I definitely want to keep my eye on, although it's one of those decks where when you go into a tournament, you know that there is a deck that you don't want to play. So, unfortunately, or I should say fortunately, since it's not in the top tier decks right now, the Jeskai Dynavolt, the Grixis / Jeskai Control Shells, those are decks that we don't want to play, and we want to have specific cards that we're bringing in for them. And, I've alluded to them before, our diversified threat package. We have Tireless Trackers and Long Tusk Cubs. Although, we're not really worried about these decks because, like online, we're looking at 2.73%. And Grixis isn't even on here, but I'm sure it's at 1 to 1.5%. So in a 16 round tournament, I would think that if I played a control deck more than twice, I'm pretty unlucky. If I play it around once, that's probably the average, and I could expect to even going the entire tournament without playing it at all. That's kind of, I guess, the breakdown that I wanted to talk about with our final thoughts into where we think the metagame is going to be projected for Denver. I think we're going to see a ton of white blue flash. I think black green delirium will definitely show up, but it won't be as popular due to the fact that the Aetherworks Marvel deck is gaining popularity. I think this is the main focus to why delirium has been going down, because I think the matchup between black green and blue white is close. But I think the Aetherworks Marvel deck has black-green's number, as well as a lot of people don't realize this, that black-green Delirium doesn't really have a great aggro matchup. It has cards like Grasp of Darkness, which are great, but it has a lot of clunky things like, Liliana is great versus Spirits, but if you play Liliana and then they just kill it, you know what I mean? What else is going on? Like, yeah, you might get their one creature, their Toolcraft Exemplar, but then they can like come over the top with Copter, and depending on the deck list, like Bushwhackers and things like that. So Black Green Delirium doesn't have traditionally like the best aggressive matchup. So I think those decks will definitely appear for the Grand Prix as well. So these 4 decks, I guess, not just because they're the top 4 decks on the MTGO Goldfish. I guess shout out to them for hooking us up with some knowledge here. These are the main 4 that I want to prepare for, and it's basically the 4 that I prepared my sideboard. And it's weird. It kind of works in progressive order. Like, I have the most cards, I think, in my sideboard for Aetherworks Marvel, just because a lot of them go over. Like, the trackers are good in this matchup, but they're also good in Delirium, and they're good on the play versus White Blue Flash, and then marginal on the draw. And Mardu Vehicles, it's the lowest percentage, like I said, out of the top 4 here, and it's also the one where I'm like, the matchup's good game 1, but their nut draw is really tough to beat. And our sideboard cards don't really improve that. So if we play against a Mardu Vehicle opponent and they have like their really good draw, it's going to be tough to win that match. And I'm accepting that fact going into the tournament because, as most people know, when you prepare for a tournament, you can't have answers to everything, unless there's a matchup like, hey, Standard's got a Caw-Blade or a Pack Rat, mono black, you don't really have that kind of power level in Standard right now to where, man, this is the best deck. There's no way it could lose. It has great matchups versus everything. We're not there yet. We may be there. Maybe after the next set, there's going to be some more energy stuff and maybe a couple things get, tweaked around. But that's kind of where we're at with the metagame now. Final thoughts with the deck. So I like the deck a lot. I'm not over the moon about it. Like, I'm not like super hyped with it. I think the deck is very good. For me, the one concern I have with the deck is the fact that with running the Aetherworks Marvel, you're running a risk, and it's a calculated risk. You could do the math on how many hits you're going to have, how many things you want, but at the end of the day, there's still a lot of games where I'll sit here and I'll set everything up perfectly. I'll get the Aetherworks Marvel out. My opponent will activate Gideon. And this has happened multiple times, actually, where my opponent will, like, activate Gideon, activate Smuggler's Copter, and I'll hit the Marvel. I'll whiff. All right. And what I mean by whiff is I won't hit Ishkana, Emrakul, Descend, or now I guess Nissa's Renewal's not a whiff, but in the sense of we want to hit Descend Upon the Sinful there, we'll whiff. And then next turn, we'll set up so we can do it again, and then we'll actually miss again. And a lot of these times, it's gotten to the point where between all of the search and the looting that we're doing, between Vessel, Attune, Traverse, we're somewhat close to like 40 cards left in our deck, 45 cards left in our deck. And when you look at the top 12 and then bottom, and with a 40-card deck, like, the math says like you're supposed to hit a Descent Upon the Sinful in one of those Marvels. And sometimes you just don't, and you just lose. And so that's part of the problem with this deck that I'm not like, oh my god, in love with, because it's not one of those decks where you do everything right. You play your turn 1, Attune with Aether, your turn 2 Servant off an Aether Hub, and then you play Aetherworks Marvel, and you click it on turn 5. You don't always win that game. And just having, being able to know that going in and not get your hopes up that, hey, man, everything went, really well so far, doesn't wrap up the game. So That and the fact that, like we said, some of the matchups after sideboard, they get really tricky. Like our white-blue matchup, we want to be bringing in tiers, long tusk cubs, natural states, and if we're on the play, tireless trackers and deadlock trap. And, you got to take cards out, and a lot of time, it's a struggle on deciding, what kind of game you want to play and finding and, looking into your opponent's soul, so to speak, and going, is this a person that's playing multiple ceremonious rejections? Do I want to cut the Marvel package complete and just bring in creatures and let's run, a fair game? Or is this person that, maybe necessarily doesn't have that, they have, one or two more negates, and we want to keep the Marvel in? And having that kind of example, I guess, for each matchup that you do, it's really, really important to stay focused on what your overall game plan is and not just bringing cards that are generically good for a matchup. And what I mean by that is if my opponent has a ton of cards in their deck that natural state can kill, obviously this is a great card. But going a little deeper into that, why am I bringing Long Tusk Cub? What role does it serve in the matchup? And does the rest of the 60 that I'm presenting for game 2 or 3 line up with the plan that Long Tusk Cub wants to fight? That's a really important thing. Bringing in these cards like Tireless Tracker, like Long Tusk Cub, but having the actual, hey, what is my game plan? What is my role going to be in this game? Am I still trying to go huge with Emrakul? Am I still trying to play the control game? Do I want to cut a couple Descend Upon the Sinfuls and pick up the aggressive role? And so with playing a deck like this, you can kind of morph into what you want and just making sure that you stay attuned to what your actual role is pretty important. We went over what to expect. The changes, like I said, Nissa's Renewal is the only card that I'm really considering changing. And I actually like it, and I like it probably more than I should, just because, this is the school of Dan Ward deck building where I like to play cards that people aren't familiar with playing against and just catch people off guard. It's kind of one of my favorite things to do in Magic. So, yeah. So here's the 75. If you're going to be at Grand Prix Denver this weekend, you can see me. You can ask me questions on the deck. If you're going to be playing at your local game stores, your LGSs, you're going to be getting into some IQs maybe, or we're talking some Saturday showdowns to win some of these treasure packs, feel free to hit me up on BigWard28 on Twitter, and you can also message me on Facebook. I have no problem answering that. I'll be leaving for Denver Thursday and following up with a little bit of a report maybe on the weekly ward with Kevin on Wednesday at 12:30. So that's going to do it here for part 4, the bonus coverage and final thoughts of the constructed accumulated knowledge. So I hope everyone enjoyed the series, and I look forward to doing it again. Everyone have a great weekend, and I hope you enjoy the deck. Take care.
People of Kaladesh, whether you hail from distant fields or greenbelt towns, or from our great city centers, this is your time. The Kaladesh Inventors Fair invites you, our best and brightest, to share your ingenuity with the world. As an official entrant, you may fuel your creativity with unrestricted ether access. Demonstrate that you can channel the ether into bold, new creations. Showcase your ideas, your inventions, your genius. In this time when anything is buildable, you can invent your tomorrow today.